Hello students! Today we will be talking about Dunn Halonen Chapter 2. This covers essentially what you can expect in your psychology major. So some of these things might be things that you already know, having looked into the major before, but for some of you, if you've only recently decided to major in psychology, you might not be aware of these things, and especially if you're transferring schools, knowing what kind of programs to look into for transferring for a bachelor's program might be really helpful for you. So let's get into it. Why do people choose psychology as a major? Well, there's a couple main reasons. Like psychologists, we like to study humans. Undergraduate psychologists are one of the most common subjects for psych studies. So a really easy question to ask undergrad psych students is, why did you choose to be a psych major? So we've got a lot of studies on this, and some of the main reasons are often personal experience leads to an interest in psychology. So whatever that personal experience can be, it can be treatment, they're near someone who does psychology, so whether they're doing research or therapy, so some kind of personal experience leads to the interest in psychology. Some people started psychology because the media made it look interesting, so that's a pretty common thing, whether it's watching a psychologist in a show or something like that, or thinking, oh, that does seem like a neat job I might want to do or learn about. So it might be that they fit or find it when they're taking their intro classes. So one very common thing is to take a Psych 100 level course, so like general psychology, as part of your graduation requirements before you've decided a major or things like that, and then realizing, oh, this is nice, I like it, it fits well with things that I'm interested in. So that's a pretty common thing as well. So are there any benefits or weaknesses to any of these reasons for entering the major? So this isn't actually part of your discussion board for this week, but think about it. Are any of those bad reasons to get into the major? It's not a trick question. The answer is no. There's really no bad reasons to get into the major. Whatever led to your interest in psychology, we're glad you're here. So with this, most majors in all universities tend to be pretty similar. Mainly because they're accredited in the US in the same way, so you kind of have to cover certain topics and things like that. So a lot of it comes down to that. So most bachelor's programs are really similar. You might find programs that kind of emphasize in clinical a little bit, or neuroscience a little bit, or cognitive, social psych a little bit. So cognitive and social psych are some of the more common ones to see. I don't know that I've ever seen a bachelor's program. I wrote this slide, but I don't know that I've actually ever seen one that focuses a little more on the humanistic side. So I find it funny that I wrote that. So generally, with psych majors, you'll start with an intro class. So at Salt Lake Community College, this is 1010 general psychology. Other schools, it's been Psych 100 or things like that. So that's your general psych course. The name might be different, but generally they're all the same. They cover really briefly and broadly every different aspect of psychology. A little bit of history, a little bit of cognition, a little bit of development, a little bit of abnormal psych, and just get you a little bit of a taste. And so for those of you in this class, that might, to this point, be the only class you've taken. Hopefully you've taken some other psych classes too, or you are currently while you're taking this course. Other coursework that is required in all bachelor programs are a research or statistics course. Some schools will combine those, some schools will have those separate. It just depends what kind of work that they have in other classes. But you need some experience in understanding research, you need some experience understanding statistics, maybe even if you take a math course in statistics, that will probably in most places cover that statistics portion of it, but you'd still need to learn a little bit about research methods. So there might be some flexibility in which courses to choose. If you want to choose that might also fit your math credit. So look and plan, talk with academic advisors to see what's a good way to get what you want, the skills that you want out of a psych major. Generally, always history of psych will be a required course, and that will go over the history of psychology in a lot of detail. It won't focus so much on like cognition or behaviorism or humanistic psych or abnormal psych. It'll talk about key points in the history of the field of psychology. And then oftentimes a capstone course is required where you have to do some kind of project, whether it's a paper, a presentation, research on your own. Some sort of capstone course is often required, but not always. So it depends on the major themselves. They can kind of fit that requirement in like other class assignments that you have to do. But you can look into that if you're looking to transfer schools, and if that is a deal breaker, you want one with a capstone or you don't, that could be a good thing to look for as you're thinking about transferring schools. So for, say, a bachelor's program. So other coursework that you'll do, generally you'll have to take a social or something like a social psych class, an abnormal psych class, cognitive, behavioral. You might do something like positive psych. Some schools are offering that more now. And with this, I often see it might not be required to absolutely do the social psych or the abnormal psych, but they tend to be offered more often because students are interested in those subjects. So even though they might be electives, they're generally ones that students do take. So you might not have to take or be required to take them. Technically they're electives, but in most places social, abnormal, and even sometimes cognitive seem to be not technically required, but electives that most people do. So if you have a positive psych course, take that. I find it to be very useful. So with this, the requirement is between 30 and 40 hours of combined psych-specific coursework total. So with that, some schools you might have social or even anthropology courses that might count towards it, but you'll have to look at that specific information for your major for whatever schools that you're going into. And generally, you can kind of expect this 30 to 40 hours to be psych-specific coursework. So things at Salt Lake Community College, I forget the code, the course codes, like PSY or whatever. So it has to be like that course code. So with this, depending on the school, you might have some focus. Oh, I misspelled that. I just recognized that. Hopefully I remember at the end of this lecture and I can go and fix that. But that's funny. So you might have a focus on a specific area. So you might have a bachelor's with an emphasis in industrial organizational psychology. You might have a bachelor's in psychology with an emphasis in clinical psychology. Your bachelor's is probably still, like on your degree, it probably still says bachelor's in psychology, BA or BS in psychology. It might on the degree say emphasis in clinical psych or industrial organizational psych, but often the actual degree itself won't have that emphasis on it. So usually for a bachelor's it will be BA or BS in psychology, and then in your program you'll know that it's developmental psych focus, social psych focus. These are some of the most common ones that I see at different schools, is industrial organizational, clinical, developmental, and social as the emphasis in a bachelor's program. So if you have an idea of what you want career-wise, psychology-wise, if you want to go into clinical psychology, finding an undergrad program with an emphasis in clinical psychology will give you a few more clinical psych classes. Or if you want developmental psychology, you'll get a few more developmental focused classes. And more of the faculty there will be focused on that area, will be doing research or have their degree in that area. So if that's something you want, is a focus in your bachelor's degree, look for programs that have that in their focus. And you'll be able to find that on their own websites, scrolling through what their program is like, if they do have emphases in their degrees. So with this, if you pick a school that offers it. Minors are another way to get additional emphasis or build skills in a related field. Don't do what I did. I had a double minor. One was sociology, which was related, which was very useful, but also photography. Photography, I was like, I could do that. I'm allowed to do that at the school I was at as a double minor. So I could take photography classes, and that would be a lot of fun, and it was. But it's completely irrelevant to what I'm doing. So maybe in that sense I have some life experience that was beneficial, maybe a little more balanced person because of that. But a good thing to do with your minor is to build skills in a related field. So something you might do is do a minor in biology, business, computer science, math, sociology, depending on what you want to do career-wise in the future. If you want to, say, open a business in the future, but you want a psych undergrad degree, maybe a minor in business might be a good thing to do. Even a nonprofit doing business courses would be really good for that. Computer science, if you want to use computer sciences and build tools or even apps for people for treatment, doing a minor in that area could be really, really useful. So think about what you want to do in the future. Pick a minor that's relevant. Like I mentioned, I picked sociology as the relevant minor, which was really good, especially when talking about developmental psychology, which is my emphasis, thinking about all the systems that work together. I can look at that a little bit better from the kind of the sociological perspective as well as the psychological perspective. And psychology generally focuses a little more on like individuals and how those systems interact with the individual. Sociology is a little bit more about systems interacting with systems or larger groups. So useful skills connected to each other. So think about any other minors that might support your specific career that you're thinking of or you're interested in, and then choose the minors in that way. With that, minors are generally less coursework. So we talked about like 30 to 40 hours of psych coursework. A minor should probably be 20 or so hours of coursework in that specific area. You'll have to ask academic advisors. In some cases, classes might count towards a minor as well as a major, but just make sure you're getting to a specific credit hours for the major and the minor. So talk to academic advisors. Each school is going to be a little bit different, but it is pretty uniform across schools as well. So some people come into psychology because they feel like it's going to be an easy major. So let's talk about what psych majors are not. We've talked about kind of what the basic structure is going to be like, but what are they not like? Well, like we've mentioned in other classes, a lot of people feel like they have a general idea about psychology already. If 83%, I think it was about 83% of people feel like they have a good understanding of psychology. If they feel like they have an understanding of common sense psychology, they might come into psychology because they think psych is going to be an easy major. So, depending on your skills, it might be a little easier, it might be a little more difficult, but it's definitely not an easy major. So, even those who find a 100 level class easy might switch into psychology thinking that the field is easy, and generally what I find is 100 level psych classes are very easy. I mean, this is also for me, looking back, when I was in a 100 level psych class, I didn't feel like it was super easy at the time, but when I'm now making a 100 level versus a 300 level class, I feel like it's a lot easier. But psych is not an easy major. There's a lot of things you're learning and skills that we're giving to you in a psych major. So the scientific method, learning about it, learning how it's used, even possibly how to use it yourself. The scientific method is a skill that we're trying to give you. Statistics, like I said, any individual class might not be super heavy, but you are required to do some statistics work for a bachelor's in psychology. So that might not be easy for you. Biology, you have to have an understanding of biology. The history of psych, that can be a really hard one for some people or a really easy one for some people. Some people remember things like names and dates and things like that. I was really glad my instructor for my history of psych courses allowed notes on exams, otherwise that would have been super difficult. Specialty areas of psychology. There's a lot of different fields in psychology. Just today we've talked about industrial organizational, positive psychology, clinical, developmental, humanistic. So there's so many different areas to specialize in psychology that in most classes you're just going to barely touch on these things. And with that, it might not get too deep into each of those specialty areas, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. So, with a bachelor's degree, you are not qualified to be a therapist. So this is another thing that psychology majors are not. So you're not qualified to do therapy or counsel people with a bachelor's degree, as well as with an associate's degree. So to practice, you need to have a PhD, but more likely a PsyD, a master's degree as well. So a master's of clinical or counseling psychology. So with a bachelor's, you might work under someone who has, say, a master's or a PsyD or a PhD. So PhD is Doctor of Philosophy in Psychology. PsyD is Psychology Doctorate. So they're a little bit different. We'll talk about them later on in the Dunn Halonen book. PsyD is a little more clinical focused. PhD is a little more research focused. In general, any given program might have a little bit of adjustments, but generally PsyD is intended to be more focused on actual clinical practice in the training. So with this, as a person with an associate's degree or bachelor's degree, you might do therapy type things under the supervision of someone with a master's or a PhD or a PsyD, but you yourself will not be making treatment plans. You might give input to the clients you're working with, but it would be someone with that master's, PsyD, or PhD who's actually making the treatment plans, letting you know what to train on, what specific skills you need to go through this additional training, read these books or papers. So you could do therapy type of things, work individually one-on-one with people, but you're going to be working under someone with the master's, PsyD, or PhD. So you're not going to have your bachelor's and go and start your own practice, for example. You would definitely need to go on for at least a master's there. So, and you're technically not called a psychologist. That wouldn't be your title or job description. So, psychology majors are not a great way to solve your own problems. So, some people might join the major to help understand themselves better. It can be a common motivation to start and learn psychology, and it's not a bad motivation. But with that, psych classes are not therapy. So, you're definitely going to learn skills in psych classes that could help you in your day-to-day life. We talk about study skills that we've learned from cognitive psychology. Hopefully that helps you the whole rest of your life. I really like teaching about that because I really do think it can be really useful. But that's not the same thing as therapy. Even learning about therapeutic techniques is not the same as experiencing and going through therapy. So a psych major, you shouldn't be expecting it to solve your own problems that you might want to get therapy for. So, psych major is not, you probably know this already. We've already talked about how some people say get a different career and try to convince people out of psych. It's not a great way to get rich quick. With this, most psych graduates move into a workforce, not graduate school or clinical practice. And at that point, with just an associate's or bachelor's, the general pay scale is a little less than you might see in a comparative science like biology or chemistry or physics. So we see that also translate in master's degree and PhDs, that it's not paid quite as much as someone with a similar level training in, say, biology, chemistry, or physics. So, with this, most entry-level positions in general that require a bachelor's degree make relatively lower wages as compared to, say, a master's or PhD or PsyD. There may be more opportunities for promotions, though, if you have that bachelor's degree. So there are some industries that all you need is a bachelor's degree as a prerequisite requirement. Psychology is a good one that gives you a broad sense of understanding people. And that can help you with working with people, which is really important for any industry. So that could be a good way to move into industry, get promotions relevant to that specific industry. So here is a little graph from 2019 about salary distributions by psychology degree. So you can see these little lumps here are around where like the mean is, so 50th percentile here, and you can compare the distribution for someone with a doctoral degree is quite a bit more spread out versus it's a little bit more narrow here for a bachelor's and then a master's. So it can give you some kind of idea of what kind of wage you can be expecting to make in the future. So with this, people who work in social services at the bachelor's level may earn less than other STEM fields, they can still earn a respectable living. So psychology major is not a good way to get rich quick, but it's definitely a career that you can make money out of, and with your training, you can be really useful in a lot of different fields as well. So planning on what you want to do career-wise can be really useful. And so your book goes kind of onto a tangent in why it can be really beneficial to focus on the meaning that you can get out of a psych degree rather than the money, because at a certain income level, happiness doesn't seem to increase for people. And that is a useful thing to talk about. It was an interesting thing that was found by positive psychologists earlier on in the field, but more recent research shows that that kind of idea that once you make about $75,000, doesn't matter if you make more or less, that's really not the whole picture here, because there are other variables here that really matter to the well-being of a person. So here is a abstract of a paper. Feel free to pause this and read the whole thing. I'm just going to point out a couple specific things. One is this was a meta-analysis, so a study of studies. So essentially ever since that number was found, like the magic $75,000 number was found, there's been other studies to say, well, where does that not apply? Or how is this related to other things? So this study did a good job at doing a meta-analysis of a lot of those studies to really find what is the link between income and well-being. So, I thought I had a slide where this was all, where I had some things underlined. I guess I must have accidentally deleted that. Well, that's annoying. I guess I'll go through and point out some things with my mouse here. So as long as I have the screen recording the mouse, which it should be. I usually keep that on. But let's look at a couple of these other variables. So some of the things that they were interested in, obviously, social economic status, which sometimes is only measured with income, but really additional things go into that, like the prestige of your job is one thing that goes into socioeconomic status. And subjective well-being, so how does a person individually feel like they have high well-being or not have high well-being? So across 357 studies, which total had over 2 million participants. So a good selection of studies that looked at these variables. They looked at the socioeconomic status and subjective well-being association. So this was the correlation between the two. So R of 0.22. So hopefully you remember at this point, unless this lecture comes before the stats one, that an R of 0.22 is a positive correlation, but it's not super huge. So it's not a super huge correlation. So the income social well-being was comparable to the ladder socioeconomic status. So how much do they feel like they can move up the ladder of socioeconomic status? But some other things like education, and also did they feel like they were, I don't see it defined here. So subjective well-being associations were strengthened when with population density. So in areas where there was more dense population, it was different. When there was decreased income inequality, so if you live in an area that's less dense and has higher income inequality, that correlation between that $75,000 number and your actual subjective well-being essentially doesn't exist. And if you don't feel like you have relative social mobility, then your subjective well-being is not going to be increased. So there's a lot more than just making $75,000 a year to subjective well-being. So this is one thing that the book kind of emphasizes is, hey, you can make that much doing psychology, so you'll be fine, kind of thing. And it is kind of a funny thing in a psych-specific book for the field, because we know more recent research, and some of this has come out since that book was written and that chapter was written, but there's a lot more that goes into feeling good about life and what you're doing and having that subjective well-being than just making that amount of money. Also has to do with where you live, has to do with the income inequality where you live. Do you feel like you have social mobility? These things all impact, do you have this higher subjective well-being? Because that's what I would like for everybody, essentially, is everybody have high subjective well-being. Everybody feels like they have a good life. So with that, I did want to show a little website here that has basically a whole list of different careers that you might go into for psychology majors. So again, these aren't necessarily mental health focused. So these ones up here are focused in business area. What are jobs that often have the requirement of, say, a bachelor's degree that a psych degree would be really useful for? So any kind of management position, for example. Knowing a lot about psychology could really help with that. There's some mental health services, other kinds of positions that having a psych degree could be really helpful with. So go through this, see if there's any other ideas that you could do with a bachelor's or even associates in some of these cases with psychology that might be useful or interesting to you. So going back to this, I'm just going to speed through a few of these because I feel like I might have accidentally deleted a section. If so, I'll redo this video and make sure. But it looks like right now I have everything in there that I intended to. So it's a shorter chapter, but it gives you an idea of what you're looking for in the structure of a major in general, what it's going to look like even if you transfer schools. Those schools are going to have kind of the same kind of focus on the courses that you'll have to take, like history of psych. You'll need to take a stats class, research methods class. Sometimes those are combined, sometimes those are separate. But definitely a reminder to, as you look into a school's coursework, as you're thinking of transferring or doing another program, look for, do they have emphases that you would want to jump into to help make your decision of where you would want to go and get your education? What kind of training can you get there at that specific place? If you want more clinical training, most programs in psych don't have a lot of clinical focus. You might have only an abnormal psych class. You might touch on things in other classes, but if you want more of that, find a program that offers that. So hopefully this was helpful as you think about the pathway towards a bachelor's in psychology.